The knife was already at his throat when Edward Langford remembered he had a wife. He had walked into his own study, tired from a 5-year war, expecting silence and dust. Instead, a man he did not know stood behind the desk, and a blade pressed against Edward's neck came from a second man he had not seen enter the room at all. "Say her name," the man behind the desk said. His voice was calm, which made it worse. "Say the name of your wife, Duke Langford, or I will let my friend finish what he started." Edward's mind went blank. He searched through 5 years of battles, 5 years of orders and marches and men dying beside him, and he found nothing. No name, no face, only a contract he had signed without reading years ago, before the war took every other memory and replaced it with gunpowder and mud. "I don't remember," he said, because lying with a blade at his throat felt more dangerous than the truth. The man behind the desk laughed, but it was not a warm laugh. It was the laugh of someone who had waited a long time to hear exactly those words. "Then you have already lost," he said, "because she remembers everything, and she has spent 5 years making sure your forgetting would cost you everything you have." The blade pulled back half an inch, not because the danger had passed, but because the man behind the desk wanted Edward alive long enough to understand what he was about to lose. His name was Charles Winter, and he was Edward's cousin. Edward had known him as a boy who cried when he lost at cards. The man standing in the study now did not look like he cried at anything. "You forgot her," Charles said. "That is going to be very useful to me." Edward's estate, the house he had grown up in, the title his father had carried before him, all of it sat balanced on a single fact that Charles now held like a weapon. A duke who forgot his own wife was a duke who could be challenged. A marriage built on forgetting could be questioned in court, picked apart, called false. And if the marriage fell, so did the child born from it. And if the child fell, the title passed sideways to the nearest man with the right blood and the wrong heart. To Charles. "Where is she?" Edward said. His voice did not shake, though his hands wanted to. Charles smiled. "Ask her yourself if you can find her before I do." The man with the knife stepped back. Charles walked past Edward without touching him, close enough that Edward could smell the wine on his breath, and left the study as if he owned it already. The door closed. Edward stood alone in a room that had once been his father's, breathing hard, trying to remember a woman's face he had never truly looked at. He had 5 years to make up for. He did not know yet that he had only a few days to do it in. Outside the study window, in the garden below, a boy of 6 was practicing sword fighting with a wooden stick, laughing every time he lost his balance and fell into the grass. Edward did not know the boy's name yet. He did not know the boy was his son. He only knew, watching from the window with his heart pounding from the blade that had just left his throat, that something in that garden mattered more than anything Charles Winter could threaten him with. He went to find her. Her name, he would learn within the hour, was Alice. Alice Langford, though she had stopped using his name in her own mind years ago, the way you stop wearing a coat that never fit. She was not in the house. The old butler, a man named Simon who had served the family for 30 years, told Edward she had left that morning for the Eastern Road, and that she had taken guards with her, and that she had not said when she would return. "Why would she need guards on the Eastern Road?" Edward asked. Simon's face changed in a way that told Edward the answer was worse than anything he had imagined on the ride home from war. "Because Lord Winter's men have been seen on that road for 2 weeks, Simon said, watching the house, watching her. We thought, my lord, that you already knew." Edward had known nothing. He had spent 5 years learning how to survive a war, and he had come home to find a second war already being fought inside his own family, one he had missed entirely because he had been too busy forgetting the person who was fighting it. He rode after her within the hour alone, because every guard in the house had already gone with her, and because waiting for reinforcements felt like a luxury he no longer had. The road east ran through thick forest before it opened onto the flatter land near the old mill, and it was in that forest, half a mile past the last farmhouse, that Edward found the first sign that something had gone wrong. A cart overturned. A horse dead in its harness, an arrow still buried in its neck. No bodies, no blood on the road itself, which somehow frightened him more than blood would have. He got down from his horse and searched the tree line. Footprints, many of them leading away from the road into the deeper woods. Some of the prints were small, a child's boots. His son, Henry. He did not yet know the boy's name, but some part of him, some part that had nothing to do with memory or contracts or war, understood in that moment that the boy from the garden had been taken, and that the woman he could not remember had gone into the woods to get him back. He followed the prints. The forest swallowed sound the way it swallows light, and Edward moved through it as quietly as 5 years of survival had taught him to move, which was quietly enough that he heard voices before he saw the men making them. 3 of them, standing around a small fire, laughing about something that made Edward's stomach turn even before he understood the joke. "The Duchess thinks she can buy back her own son," one of them said. "As if Lord Winter wants money, he wants the title. The boy is just the key that opens the door." Edward had never killed a man outside of war before. He had told himself, riding home from 5 years of battles, that he was done with all of it, that he would spend the rest of his life learning how to be a husband and a father instead of a soldier. The forest had other plans. He moved before he decided to move, the way soldiers learned to, and by the time his mind caught up with his body, 2 of the 3 men were on the ground and the third was running. And Edward let him run because chasing him meant losing precious time, and time was the one thing he did not have to spare. Deeper in the woods, in a clearing lit by a single lantern, he found her. Alice Langford was smaller than he expected, and angrier than he had prepared for, and she was standing between 2 armed men and a boy tied to a tree, and she was not crying, and she was not begging. She was negotiating, in a voice so steady it made the men holding her son visibly nervous. "You have 1 hour to release him," she was saying, "or every merchant in 3 counties stops trading with anyone connected to Lord Winter's name. I have already sent the letters. I sent them this morning, before I even knew you had taken my son, because I have learned over 5 years to prepare for exactly this kind of man." One of the men laughed at her. It was, Edward would think later, the last mistake he made that night. Edward stepped out of the trees with no plan beyond the simple fact that his son was tied to a tree, and his wife was standing alone against 2 men with knives, and something in him that had nothing to do with contracts or memory or 5 years of forgetting simply refused to let either of those things remain true for 1 more minute. The fight was short and ugly, and left Edward with a cut along his forearm that would scar, and left both of Charles Winter's men on the ground, and left Alice staring at him across the clearing with an expression he could not name yet, because he had not yet learned enough about her to know what her expressions meant. "You came," she said. "Not thank you. Not who are you after all this time." Just those 2 words, flat and disbelieving, as if his arrival contradicted everything 5 years of forgetting had taught her to expect. "I forgot I had a wife," Edward said, because it was still the truest thing he knew how to say, and because some part of him understood that lying to her now, after everything, would be the worst thing he could do. Alice untied their son from the tree, wrapped her coat around his shoulders, and looked at Edward with an expression that finally resolved itself into something he could read. It was not forgiveness. It was something colder and more useful. It was calculation. "Then you have a great deal to remember," she said, "and very little time to do it in. Lord Winter is not finished. He came for our son tonight because he could not find a faster way to break me. Tomorrow he will try something else. And this time, husband, you are going to help me stop him." "Henry." The boy looked up at Edward with the frank curiosity of a child meeting a stranger who had somehow also arrived to save him. He did not call Edward father. He did not know the word applied. He simply asked, in the practical tone of a 6-year-old assessing a new ally, whether Edward knew how to use a sword better than the men who had tied him to the tree. "Better than that, I hope," Edward said. Henry considered this answer seriously, then nodded, satisfied, and took his mother's hand. They walked back toward the road together, the three of them, strangers bound by paper and blood and one terrible night in the woods, while somewhere behind them, in the dark, the man who had escaped ran to tell Charles Winter that his plan had failed. It would not stop him from trying again. They rode back to the house in silence, because there was too much to say and no good place to begin saying it. Edward carried Henry on his own horse for the last mile, the boy asleep against his chest, and he found himself studying the small sleeping face for any resemblance to his own, searching for proof of a bond his memory could not supply on its own. He found it in the boy's frown, which was unmistakably his father's frown, worn small. Alice watched him notice this and said nothing, but something in her posture eased, just slightly, as if she had been waiting 5 years for exactly this moment and had stopped believing it would ever come. The house, when they reached it, no longer felt like a place Edward had grown up in. It felt like a fortress that had been under siege long before he arrived to defend it, run by a woman who had learned, alone, how to fight wars that had no soldiers and no clear battlefield, only paperwork and threats and men in the dark. He was about to discover exactly how long that war had been going on, and exactly how much it had already cost her. Inside the house, Simon the butler waited by the fire with a face that had aged years in a single night. He did not ask what happened in the woods. He simply looked at Henry, still asleep against Edward's shoulder, and let out a breath he had clearly been holding since morning. "There is food in the kitchen," he said, "and there is something you both need to see before either of you sleeps." He led them not to the kitchen, but to a small room off the main hall that Edward did not remember, though he was beginning to understand that his memory could no longer be trusted as a measure of what was real in this house. The room was lined with shelves, and the shelves were lined with boxes, and the boxes were filled with paper. "What is this?" Edward asked. 5 years, Alice said, setting Henry down gently on a couch in the corner, tucking a blanket around him without looking away from the shelves. "Every letter Lord Winter's people sent to the merchants who supply this estate, every attempt he made to buy the loyalty of the stewards, every false claim he tried to plant in the county records suggesting our marriage was never properly witnessed. I kept all of it, because a man like Charles Winter never stops with one attack. He tries 100 small ones and waits to see which one works." Edward picked up one of the letters. The handwriting was neat, almost friendly, the kind of handwriting that made threats sound like invitations to dinner. "He has been doing this the entire time I was away," Edward said. "It was not a question." "He started within a year of your leaving," Alice said. "He assumed a duke who rode off to war and never wrote home was a duke who did not care what happened to his own house. He was almost right, wasn't he?" The words landed exactly where she intended them to land, and Edward did not defend himself, because there was no defense that would not sound like an excuse. "I'm not asking you to forgive 5 years," Alice continued, "and I have stopped needing anyone's forgiveness a long time ago. I am asking you to be useful. Tonight proved that Charles Winter is done waiting. He tried to take our son as a bargaining piece. When that fails, and it has failed, he will try something with more force behind it. We need to know what he still has planned, and the only way to know that is to think like him before he acts." Edward set the letter down and looked at the boxes lining the shelves. 5 years of a war he had not known was happening, fought entirely by a woman he had signed away on a piece of paper without ever learning her face. "Teach me," he said, "everything you know about him, everything you have learned running this house without me. I am not asking to be forgiven either. I am asking to be allowed to help." Alice studied him for a long moment, the way a general studies a soldier who has just volunteered for a mission everyone else considers too dangerous to attempt. "Then we start now," she said, "because he will not wait for morning and neither can we." They spent the rest of the night in that small room, going through boxes by candlelight, while Henry slept undisturbed on the couch, and Simon brought tea that went cold before either of them remembered to drink it. Alice explained, piece by piece, the shape of the war Charles Winter had been fighting. He had first tried money, buying the loyalty of two stewards who controlled the estate's trade routes, hoping to starve the house of income slowly enough that no one would notice the cause. Alice had discovered the theft within months, dismissed both men quietly, and replaced them with people from the village whose families had worked the land for generations and had no ambition beyond keeping it running well. When money failed, Charles tried rumor. Letters appeared in the county, unsigned, suggesting that the Duke's marriage had been arranged under false pretenses, that the woman living in the house was not truly a duchess at all, only a woman claiming a title that was never legally hers. Alice had responded not with denial, which she knew would only feed the rumor, but with proof. She had gathered every witness present at the wedding, had the marriage re-recorded in the county archive with 3 separate signatures of confirmation, and made certain that any lawyer Charles hired would find nothing but a wall of documented fact. "He is careful," Alice said, "but he is not patient. Every time one plan fails, he grows more reckless with the next. Tonight, taking Henry directly, that was not the plan of a careful man. That was the plan of a man who is running out of time." "Running out of time for what?" Edward asked. Alice hesitated, and in that hesitation, Edward understood there was something she had not yet told him, something bigger than stolen trade routes and false rumors. "There is a vote coming," she said finally. "In 3 weeks, the regional council decides who receives the crown's support for a new trade agreement along the eastern rivers. Whoever holds this title when that vote happens gains control of the river trade for the next generation. Charles does not simply want your title for pride. He wants it because in 3 weeks it becomes worth more money than either of us can easily imagine. If he can prove the marriage false, or if he can prove the heir is not legitimately yours, the title reverts to the nearest blood relative before the vote takes place. And the nearest blood relative is him." Edward sat back, the full shape of the danger finally visible to him. This was not a family dispute over pride and old grudges. This was a war with a deadline, and the deadline was close enough that Charles Winter had already been willing to send men into the woods to snatch a 6-year-old boy from his own mother. 3 weeks, Edward said. 3 weeks, Alice repeated. "And he already tried the boy tonight because he is desperate. He will try something bigger next, something that cannot be undone with a clever letter or a well-timed document. We need allies, husband, people who will stand with us publicly before the council meets, so that Charles cannot simply buy silence from every witness in the county." "Who do we trust?" Edward asked. Alice's expression sharpened into something that looked almost like the ghost of a smile. "There is a man," she said, "a captain who served under your father years ago, before you were even old enough to hold a sword. His name is Daniel Rourke, and he owes this family a debt he has never been able to repay, because your father saved his life once and never asked for anything in return. He commands the river garrison now, the very soldiers who guard the trade routes Charles wants so badly. If Daniel Rourke stands publicly on our side before the council meets, Charles loses his strongest argument before he even makes it." "And if he refuses?" Edward asked. "Then we are exactly where we started tonight," Alice said, "alone and running out of time." They did not sleep that night. By morning, a letter was already on its way to the river garrison, carried by Simon's fastest rider, asking Captain Daniel Rourke for a meeting he could not easily refuse. The reply came back faster than either of them expected, and it was not the answer they had hoped for. Daniel Rourke would not come to the house. He asked instead that the Duke and Duchess come to him, at the garrison, in 3 days' time, and he gave no reason for the delay beyond a single sentence written in a hand that seemed careful not to say too much on paper. "There are ears in this house that do not belong to your family," the letter said. "Come to me instead, and come quietly, and tell no one but yourselves where you are going." Alice read the letter twice before handing it to Edward without a word. "Someone in this house is working for Charles," she said finally. "It has to be that. Nothing else explains a man like Daniel Rourke being that careful with a simple invitation." Edward thought of every servant he had passed since arriving home the night before, every familiar face he had once known as a boy and had not truly looked at since. 5 years away had made strangers of people who had once been part of his childhood, and now one of those strangers might be feeding every private word in this house directly to the man trying to destroy it. "We tell no one," Edward said. "Not Simon, not the stewards. No one but the three of us know where we are truly going, and even Henry does not need to know more than that we are taking a trip." Alice nodded, already thinking 3 steps ahead, already planning the false story they would tell the household to explain their absence, already calculating which roads Charles Winter's men were least likely to be watching. 3 days felt like a very long time to wait, with a spy somewhere inside the walls and a deadline drawing closer every hour. But there was no faster way to reach Daniel Rourke, and no other ally Alice trusted enough to risk everything on. They spent those 3 days pretending nothing had changed, smiling at servants they no longer fully trusted, laughing with Henry in the garden as if the world outside the estate walls held nothing more dangerous than bad weather, all while quietly preparing for a journey that could either save everything they had left or hand it directly to the man trying to take it. On the morning of the 3rd day, they left before sunrise, telling the household they were visiting a distant cousin for a few days of rest after Edward's long return from war. Henry rode between them, delighted by the early start, certain the whole trip was an adventure and nothing more. Neither of his parents corrected him. The road to the river Garrison ran through open country, easier to watch and easier to be watched from, and Edward found himself scanning every tree line and every distant rooftop the way he had once scanned enemy ground before a battle, searching for the shape of a threat before it had the chance to become one. It was nearly midday when Alice, riding just ahead of him, suddenly pulled her horse to a stop. "Someone is following us," she said quietly. "3rd time I have seen the same rider on the ridge behind us since we left the last village." Edward turned in his saddle. Far behind them on a low ridge overlooking the road, a single rider sat motionless, watching. Whoever it was, they were no longer trying very hard to stay hidden. Edward turned his horse without hesitation and rode back toward the ridge, leaving Alice to keep Henry moving forward along the main road. He had learned in 5 years of war that a watching enemy left alone only grew bolder, and he had no intention of letting this one report back to Charles Winter with fresh information about where the Duke and Duchess were traveling. The rider on the ridge saw him coming and turned to flee, but the ground favored Edward, and within a few minutes he had closed the distance enough to see the man clearly. It was not one of Charles Winter's usual hired men. It was younger, thinner, dressed like a farmhand rather than a soldier, and when Edward finally forced the man's horse into a dead end formed by a fallen tree and a steep bank, the rider raised both hands immediately, without a single attempt to fight. "I am not here to hurt anyone," the young man said quickly. "I was only told to watch and report where you were going. I did not know it would be a family with a child. I would not have taken the work if I had known that." "Who sent you?" Edward asked. "A man who pays well and asks no questions in return," the young man said. "I do not know his name. I was hired in the village 3 days ago by someone who described exactly what you and your wife look like and told me to follow whichever direction you rode." Edward studied the man's face and found nothing there but genuine fear, the kind that came from realizing too late what kind of work he had actually agreed to do. It was not proof of innocence, but it was enough to make Edward believe the young man was telling the truth about his own small part in a much larger scheme. "Go home," Edward said. "Tell whoever hired you that you lost our trail in the hills and never take work like this again." The young man nodded rapidly, turned his horse, and rode away without looking back even once, clearly grateful to be leaving with nothing worse than a warning. Edward rode back to rejoin Alice and Henry, turning the encounter over in his mind. Charles Winter had hired a stranger from the village rather than using his own men, which meant he was being careful about who he trusted with knowledge of their movements, which in turn meant something inside Edward's own house was still feeding him information more reliable than any hired watcher on a ridge. They reached the river Garrison as the sun began to lower, and the sight of it eased something tight in Edward's chest that he had not fully noticed carrying until that moment. Rows of soldiers drilled in the yard beyond tall wooden walls, and above the gate flew a banner Edward recognized from childhood memories that felt, for once, reliable and solid rather than clouded by 5 years of forgetting. Captain Daniel Rourke met them himself at the gate, a broad man with gray beginning to show at his temples and eyes that studied Edward for a long moment before softening into something like recognition. "You have your father's exact way of sitting a horse," Daniel said. "I would have known you anywhere, war or no war." He led them inside quickly, away from the open yard, and into a private room within the garrison's main hall, where the walls were thick enough that no conversation held there could easily be overheard from outside. "I apologize for the strange invitation," Daniel said once the door was closed. "But I have reason to believe Lord Winter has friends inside your own household, Duke Langford, and I did not want to risk a letter of mine falling into the wrong hands before we had even spoken face to face." "We suspected the same thing," Alice said. "A letter of ours meant only for you was answered with unusual caution, and that caution alone told us something was wrong long before we understood exactly what." Daniel nodded slowly, then walked to a small chest in the corner of the room and produced a folded document, which he handed directly to Alice rather than Edward, a choice Edward noted without comment, understanding that whatever trust existed here had clearly been built between Daniel and Alice during the years Edward himself had been absent. "3 weeks ago," Daniel said, "one of my own junior officers approached me quietly and confessed that he had been offered a considerable sum of money to delay the garrison's response if any trouble occurred near your estate in the coming month. He did not accept the offer. He came to me instead, because his own father served alongside yours, Duke Langford, and he could not bring himself to betray that history for money. But the man who approached him did not act alone. He was following instructions from someone with access to detailed knowledge of this garrison's patrol schedules, knowledge that only a handful of people outside these walls could possibly have obtained." Alice unfolded the document and read it in silence, her expression growing colder with every line. "This is a payment record," she said finally, handing it to Edward. "A record of gold moved from an account connected to Charles Winter directly to a man employed inside our own house." Edward took the paper and read the name written plainly at the bottom of the ledger, a name he recognized immediately, a name that made the floor seem to tilt slightly beneath him. Simon, the butler who had served the family for 30 years, who had greeted Edward at the door with what seemed like genuine relief on his first night home, who had brought tea into that small room lined with boxes and sat quietly nearby while Alice explained 5 years of hidden warfare. That same man had apparently been selling information to Charles Winter for months. "I do not believe it," Edward said, though even as he spoke the words he understood he did believe it, because it explained too many small details that had otherwise made no sense, including how Charles had known so precisely when Edward himself would be returning home from war, arriving with perfect timing to catch him alone, and unprepared in his own study on his very first night back. "I did not want to believe it either," Daniel said quietly. Simon served your father faithfully for decades, and men do not usually turn against a lifetime of loyalty without a reason strong enough to outweigh everything that came before it. I made inquiries. It seems Simon's brother owes a significant debt to a moneylender in the capital, a debt that would ruin the entire family if left unpaid. Charles Winter, it appears, purchased that debt outright several months ago, and has been using the threat of calling it due immediately as leverage over Simon ever since. Alice sat down slowly, the anger in her face shifting into something heavier, something closer to grief. "He is not evil," she said quietly. "He is frightened and trapped, and Charles found the exact weight that would bend him. I have known Simon since the day I first arrived in this house as a stranger with a marriage contract and no husband present to greet me. He was kind to me when almost no one else in that house had reason to be." "Kindness and betrayal are not always opposites," Daniel said. "Sometimes they live in the same man at the same time, and a person only chooses one over the other when the pressure becomes unbearable. That does not excuse what he has done. It only explains it." Edward set the payment ledger down on the table between them, and forced himself to think clearly rather than simply feeling the sharp sting of a trust he had barely had time to rebuild before discovering it had already been compromised for months. "If Simon knows everything that happens inside our house," Edward said, "then Charles already knows we are here, meeting with you right now." Daniel's expression tightened. "That is likely true, which means we no longer have the luxury of careful, quiet planning. Charles will assume that once you have proof of Simon's betrayal, and once you have secured my support, you intend to move quickly, publicly, before the council vote. He will try to strike first and strike hard, because a desperate man with only 3 weeks remaining does not have room left for patience." "What would he do," Alice asked, "if he decided to strike first?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, clearly weighing how much to say. "The council vote will be held publicly, in the regional hall, in front of witnesses from every noble family in the district. If Charles cannot invalidate your marriage or your son's legitimacy through documents and rumor before that day, his only remaining option is to disrupt the vote itself, to create enough chaos or scandal on that very day that the council delays its decision, buying him more time to build a stronger case, or worse, to remove you both from the situation entirely before you can stand there and speak for yourselves." "Remove us," Edward repeated slowly. "I do not say this to frighten you," Daniel said, "though perhaps you should be frightened. A man who hires strangers to snatch a child from the woods has already shown you the shape of what he is willing to do. I do not believe he will suddenly discover restraint now that his deadline grows shorter." Henry, who had been sitting quietly near the window through most of this conversation, playing with a small wooden soldier Daniel had given him upon their arrival, looked up at the sound of his own situation being discussed in such serious tones, though he could not have understood the full weight of what was being decided around him. "Are the bad men going to come again?" he asked, in the plain, direct way of a child who has already learned, far too young, that adults sometimes lie to spare feelings, but that the truth is usually more useful. Edward crossed the room and crouched down beside his son, meeting his eyes directly rather than offering an easy comfort that would not hold up if the danger returned. "They might try," Edward said honestly, "but you will not be alone when they do, not this time." Henry considered this answer with the same serious focus he had shown the wooden soldier, then nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned his attention to the toy in his hands, trusting the adults around him to handle the rest. Daniel watched this exchange with something softening in his expression. "I will stand with you at the council, Duke Langford, and I will bring soldiers from this garrison to guard the hall itself on the day of the vote, openly and without apology, so that Charles Winter understands exactly how much support he is truly up against. But standing beside you is not the same as winning for you. You will still need to walk into that hall and prove in front of everyone watching that your marriage is real, that your son is legitimate, and that the years you spent away at war do not give your cousin the right to take what was never his to take." "And Simon," Alice asked quietly, "what do we do about Simon?" It was Edward who answered, after a long moment of thought. "We do not confront him yet. If he still believes his betrayal is undiscovered, he remains useful to us in a way he cannot be once he knows we know. Let him keep reporting to Charles for now. We simply make certain that what he reports is exactly what we want Charles Winter to believe." Alice looked at him with an expression Edward had not yet seen from her, something that might, under slightly different circumstances, have grown into genuine respect. "That is a good plan," she said. "It is also a cruel one, using a frightened man's fear against him without warning. He chose to sell information about our son to a man who then had our son tied to a tree in the woods," Edward said. "Whatever cruelty exists in using his fear against him now is a smaller cruelty than the one he has already been part of." Alice did not argue the point further. They stayed at the garrison one more night, planning carefully with Daniel Rourke long after Henry had fallen asleep on a cot in the corner of the room, working out exactly what false information they would allow Simon to overhear once they returned home. Information designed to make Charles Winter believe his enemies were weaker and less prepared than they truly were. By the time they rode back toward the estate the next morning, Edward found himself thinking less about the 5 years he had lost and more about the 3 weeks that remained, and about the particular shape of the fight still waiting for them. A fight that would not be won with swords in a dark forest, but with truth, spoken clearly and without fear, in front of every noble family in the district. He did not yet know that Charles Winter, upon hearing false reports fed carefully through Simon over the following days, would grow so confident in his own coming victory that he would make the single mistake that would finally expose everything he had built. That mistake was still 3 days away. Simon greeted them at the door when they returned home, his relief at their safe arrival looking, to Edward's eyes now, uncomfortably genuine, as if the man could hold both real affection for this family and a desperate, secret betrayal of it inside the same tired heart. Edward said nothing of what he now knew. He simply thanked Simon for keeping the house in order during their absence, and watched the old butler's shoulders ease slightly at the ordinary kindness of it. Over the following days, Edward and Alice spoke carefully within earshot of certain rooms and certain hallways, always making certain Simon was near enough to overhear, discussing a plan that did not exist. They spoke of feeling unprepared for the council vote. They spoke of Daniel Rourke's support being weaker than hoped, his soldiers too few to matter. They spoke, once, directly outside the study door, of considering whether it might be wiser to quietly leave the estate before the vote rather than risk a public humiliation they feared they could not survive. Within 2 days, Daniel sent word through a trusted writer that Charles Winter's men had grown visibly more relaxed, pulling back some of their watchers from the roads near the estate, apparently satisfied that their enemy believed itself already defeated. "He is celebrating a victory he has not actually won," Alice said, reading Daniel's letter by the fire one evening after Henry had gone to bed. "That confidence will make him careless." "Careless men make mistakes," Edward said. "We only need one." The mistake came 4 days before the council vote, and it came in a form none of them had expected. A merchant named Grace Holloway arrived at the estate gate late one afternoon, requesting to speak with the Duchess directly and refusing to explain her business to anyone else. Alice received her in the small sitting room, and within minutes of the door closing, Edward was summoned to join them, Alice's expression pale with something between fury and disbelief. Grace Holloway ran a small trading house in the nearby town, one of the merchants who had, months earlier, received one of Charles Winter's unsigned letters questioning the legitimacy of the Langford marriage. She had ignored the letter at the time, unwilling to involve herself in a noble family's private disputes. But 2 days earlier, one of Charles Winter's men had approached her again, this time openly, offering a large sum of money in exchange for her testimony before the council, testimony claiming she had personally witnessed evidence, years ago, that the Langford marriage certificate had been forged. "I told him I would consider it," Grace said, her hands folded tightly in her lap, "because I did not know yet what I truly believed, and because the money offered was more than I earned from my shop in an entire year. But last night, the same man came back and grew impatient with my hesitation. He said something he should not have said. He said that if I refused, they had other witnesses lined up who would say whatever was needed regardless of what was true, and that my honest testimony or my false testimony would make no real difference to the outcome, only to how much money I personally walked away with. He told you the testimony against us is already false," Alice said slowly, "and that other witnesses have already agreed to lie." "He did not say it in those exact words," Grace admitted, "but there was no other way to understand what he meant. I came here instead of taking his money because my own father served this county honestly his whole life, and I did not want to spend the rest of mine knowing I had helped destroy an innocent family for a payment I would eventually feel too ashamed to spend." Edward felt something in his chest loosen slightly for the first time in days. This was not proof that would win the vote by itself, but it was the first crack in Charles Winter's careful construction, the first sign that his confidence had led him to grow careless with people he assumed money alone could control completely. "Would you say this before the council?" Alice asked carefully, "knowing that Lord Winter will not forgive you easily for it?" Grace hesitated only a moment before answering. "I would rather be poor and honest than wealthy and afraid of my own reflection. Yes, I will say it before the council." That same evening, Daniel Rourke sent further word that confirmed what Grace's visit had already suggested. 2 more names had surfaced, minor landholders who had likewise been approached with offers of money in exchange for testimony against the Langford marriage, and at least one of them had also grown uneasy enough with the arrangement to quietly reach out to the garrison, uncertain whether he wished to go through with it after all. "He built his entire plan on buying silence and manufacturing lies," Alice said, "and it is starting to fall apart because a desperate man cannot always tell the difference between someone who can be bought completely and someone who can only be bought partway." But the good news brought its own new danger. If Charles Winter discovered that his purchased witnesses were wavering, he would know his careful legal strategy was crumbling days before the vote, and a man that desperate, cornered that tightly, with that much money and pride already invested, might abandon subtlety entirely. The warning proved correct faster than any of them expected. 2 nights before the council vote, Edward woke suddenly in the dark to the sound of glass breaking somewhere below, followed almost immediately by Simon's voice shouting an alarm through the hallway, an alarm that, for once, held no trace of rehearsed calm, only genuine terror. Edward reached Alice's door within seconds, and together they ran toward Henry's room, hearts pounding with a fear too immediate for either of them to speak aloud. They found the nursery door already open, the window beside the bed broken outward rather than inward, and Henry's bed empty. For one terrible, silent moment, the entire world seemed to stop. Then a small, defiant voice called out from the hallway closet, where Henry had apparently hidden himself the moment he heard the glass break, exactly as his mother had quietly taught him to do months earlier, long before Edward had even returned home from the war, back when Alice had first begun preparing her son for a danger she had somehow always known might eventually come knocking. "I heard the window and I hid like you told me to, Mother," Henry said, emerging from the closet with wide eyes but a steady voice that made both of his parents' hearts break with pride and relief at exactly the same moment. Alice pulled him into her arms without a single word, holding him so tightly he finally let out a small sound of protest. And even that small, ordinary complaint felt, in that moment, like the sweetest sound Edward had ever heard. Downstairs, Simon and two guards had already caught the man responsible for breaking the window. A hired intruder who had apparently intended to take Henry through the broken glass before anyone in the house woke, only to be interrupted by his own carelessness in shattering the window loudly enough to wake half the household instantly. Under questioning, frightened and clearly regretting every choice that had led him to that particular window on that particular night, the intruder confirmed what none of them had needed further proof to already believe. He had been sent by Charles Winter, with orders to take the boy quietly and disappear before the council vote, removing the single strongest piece of evidence supporting the legitimacy of Edward's heir, and leaving Charles free to argue before the council that no legitimate heir currently existed at all. He panicked, Alice said quietly, once Henry had finally been settled back to sleep in his parents' own room rather than his nursery, guarded now by two soldiers Daniel Rourke had quietly sent ahead earlier that same week, positioned outside the house in case, exactly, this kind of desperation arrived before the vote. He panicked, Edward agreed, and this time, because we were prepared, his panic gained him nothing except one more piece of proof against himself. They sent word to Daniel Rourke before dawn, informing him of the failed attempt and the captured intruder's confession. Daniel's reply arrived within hours, short and certain in a way that finally allowed both Edward and Alice a small measure of real hope. "We now have everything we need," the letter said. A confession nomming Charles Winter directly in an attempted kidnapping, witnesses prepared to expose his false testimony scheme, and payment records proving his corruption of your own household staff. Bring all of it before the council in 2 days. It is time to finish this properly in the open, where he can no longer hide behind unsigned letters and frightened men. Alice read the letter twice, then finally allowed herself something Edward had not yet seen from her in all the days since his return, a small, tired, genuine smile. 2 days, she said. Then we find out whether 5 years of fighting alone was finally enough to end this properly together. Edward reached for her hand, uncertain whether the gesture would be welcomed after everything, and felt something ease in his chest when she did not pull away. "Together," he repeated, "I intend to remember every part of it this time." The regional hall stood filled to capacity on the morning of the vote, every bench occupied by nobles and merchants and landholders from across the district, all of them drawn by rumors that had spread faster than anyone could properly track, rumors of a duke who had forgotten his own wife, of a hidden heir, of a cousin's ambition, of stolen children and broken windows, and a family fighting for everything it had. Charles Winter arrived early, dressed in clothing too fine for the occasion, wearing the confident smile of a man who still believed the morning would end in his favor. He had not yet learned that his intruder sat locked in the garrison's holding cell, nor that Grace Holloway and 2 other witnesses had already met privately with the council elders before the public session even began, laying out in careful detail exactly how much money had been offered to them, and exactly what lies they had been asked to tell in exchange. Edward and Alice entered together, Henry between them, holding both of their hands, the picture of a family that needed no forged documents or rehearsed testimony to prove it was real. Daniel Rourke stood near the front of the hall in full uniform, flanked by soldiers whose presence alone spoke louder than any speech could have managed. The council elder presiding over the session, an older woman named Margaret Ashworth who had overseen more of these disputes than she cared to remember, called the hall to order and invited Charles Winter to present his claim first, as was proper for the party formally challenging an existing title. Charles rose smoothly, adjusting his coat, and began speaking with the practiced ease of a man who had rehearsed this moment for months. "Honored council," he said, "I bring this challenge not out of personal ambition, but out of genuine concern for the proper stewardship of a title left unattended for 5 long years, during which the current duke was absent, and during which serious questions have arisen regarding the legitimacy of both his marriage and the child presented to this council as his rightful heir. He gestured toward a small stack of papers on the table before him, the same false documents Edward and Alice had already seen copies of weeks earlier, the same carefully worded unsigned letters designed to plant doubt without ever risking an accusation direct enough to require proof. "I have witnesses prepared to testify," Charles continued, "who can speak to irregularities in the original marriage certificate and to circumstances surrounding the child's birth that this council deserves to understand fully before granting continued authority over trade agreements as significant as those under discussion this season." Margaret Ashworth allowed him to finish completely before speaking, her expression giving away nothing. "You may call your first witness," she said. Charles turned toward the back of the hall, expecting to see the merchants and landholders he had paid weeks earlier waiting to rise on cue. Instead, he found Grace Holloway already standing near the front of the hall, having been invited forward earlier that morning by the council elders themselves, well before Charles had arrived expecting to control the order of events. "I would like to speak, if the council permits," Grace said, "regarding an offer made to me personally by a man working on Lord Winter's behalf." Charles's confident expression flickered, just slightly, the first small crack Edward had seen in it since the man walked through the hall doors that morning. Margaret Ashworth nodded, granting permission, and Grace spoke clearly and steadily, repeating exactly what she had told Alice days earlier in the estate's small sitting room, describing the money offered, the pressure applied, and the chilling admission that other witnesses had already agreed to lie regardless of what was actually true. Murmurs spread through the hall immediately. Charles rose to object, but Margaret Ashworth raised one hand, silencing him without raising her voice at all. "You will have your opportunity to respond, Lord Winter," she said, "but this council will hear every witness fully first." 2 more witnesses followed Grace, the minor landholders Daniel Rourke had identified days earlier, both of them now visibly relieved to finally admit openly what they had been asked to falsely claim, both of them confirming that they had never actually witnessed any irregularity in the Langford marriage at all, and had only agreed to say so because of money offered by men working under Charles Winter's direction. By the time Daniel Rourke himself rose to speak, presenting the payment ledger proving Simon's compromised loyalty and the intruder's signed confession regarding the attempted kidnapping of Henry Langford, the hall had grown quiet in the particular way a room grows quiet when everyone present has already reached the same conclusion and is simply waiting to hear it confirmed aloud. Charles Winter's face had lost its earlier confidence entirely. He rose one final time, attempting to salvage something from the wreckage of his own carefully built plan. "These are servants and merchants easily pressured into saying whatever benefits the current duke," he said, though his voice had lost the smooth certainty it carried at the start of the session. "None of this proves anything beyond the fact that my cousin has more money to offer than I do for testimony favoring his position." "Lord Winter," Margaret Ashworth said, her voice carrying easily across the silent hall, "this council has heard a signed confession from a man caught in the act of attempting to kidnap a 6-year-old child from his own bed, a confession naming you directly as the one who ordered it. We have payment records showing gold moved from your accounts to a member of the Langford household staff in exchange for private information. We have 3 separate witnesses describing, independently and without contradiction, an attempt by your representatives to purchase false testimony against a marriage this council has no genuine reason to doubt was ever anything but legitimate. I do not require further evidence to reach a decision this council has, I suspect, already reached in its own mind well before I finish this sentence." She paused, letting the weight of the room settle fully before continuing. This council finds the challenge brought by Charles Winter against the Langford title to be without merit, based on evidence obtained through corruption, coercion, and attempted violence against a child. The current Duke's marriage stands confirmed. His son stands confirmed as legitimate heir, and this council will additionally be referring the matter of the attempted kidnapping to the regional magistrate for full criminal proceedings against Lord Winter personally. The hall erupted into a wave of murmured reaction, some of relief, some of surprise, though not much true surprise remained among those who had watched the morning unfold piece by careful piece. Charles Winter stood frozen for a long moment, the ambition that had driven him for months finally collapsing entirely under the simple, unglamorous weight of proof. Two of Daniel Rourke's soldiers moved forward at the magistrate's signal, and Charles offered no resistance as they escorted him from the hall, his earlier confidence replaced by the blank expression of a man only now beginning to understand exactly how completely his own desperation had betrayed him. Outside the hall afterward, in the bright, ordinary sunlight of an afternoon that felt, after everything, almost unreasonably calm, Alice knelt down to Henry's level and asked him, gently, if he understood what had just happened. "The bad man cannot try to take me any more," Henry said, with the simple confidence of a child who trusted that adults, when they finally worked together properly, could fix even the largest problems. "That's exactly right," Alice said, smoothing his hair back from his forehead. Edward stood nearby, watching the two of them, feeling something settle inside his chest that had not felt settled since he first walked into his own study and found a stranger's blade at his throat, weeks that felt now like an entire lifetime compressed into a handful of days. "I still do not remember everything," he said quietly, once Henry had run off to examine a horse tied nearby, delighted by its size and its patient temperament. 5 years is a long time to have simply thrown away. "You do not need to remember what was lost," Alice said. "You only need to be present for what comes next. I have spent 5 years building something strong enough to survive without you. I am not opposed now to building something even stronger with you." Edward looked at her, this woman he had signed away on paper without ever truly seeing, who had raised his son alone and fought off an enemy far more dangerous than either of them had first understood, and felt something that had nothing at all to do with contracts or obligation or duty. "Then let us begin," he said, "properly this time." Simon met them back at the estate gate that evening, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who had spent months carrying a secret too heavy for one person alone. Edward and Alice had already discussed, quietly, what to do about him, and rather than expose him publicly or dismiss him in shame, they called him privately into the same small room lined with boxes where this entire fight had first taken proper shape. "We know what you did," Alice said gently, "and we know why you did it." Simon's face went pale, but he did not deny it. He simply lowered his head, the shame of months finally allowed to surface openly. "Your brother's debt has already been settled," Edward said. "Daniel Rourke arranged it quietly this morning, using funds recovered from Charles Winter's own accounts as part of the magistrate's proceedings. There is no longer any leverage anyone can hold over you or your family." Simon looked up, disbelief plain on his face. "Why would you do this, after everything I allowed to happen because of my own fear?" "Because fear makes fools of good men sometimes," Alice said, "and because this house has already seen enough cruelty this season without adding more of it ourselves. You will stay if you wish to, but there can be no more secrets between us. Not ever again." Simon nodded, unable to speak for a long moment, and when he finally did, his voice carried a gratitude too large for simple words to properly hold. That evening, for the first time since Edward's return from war, the entire household gathered for a single, ordinary dinner. No hidden threats waiting in the shadows, no false conversations staged for a listening spy, no fear pressing quietly against the edges of every room. Henry fell asleep at the table before dessert was even finished, exhausted from a day too large for a 6-year-old to fully process, and Edward carried him upstairs himself, tucking him into a bed no longer guarded by soldiers outside the window, only by the ordinary safety of a house finally at peace. Alice waited for him in the hallway afterward, and for once, neither of them reached immediately for practical matters, for ledgers or threats or plans still needing to be made. "I forgot I had a wife," Edward said quietly, "and it nearly cost me everything worth having." "You remember now," Alice said. "That is what matters." "I intend to spend a very long time making up for what I missed," Edward said. Alice allowed herself, finally, a small and genuine smile, the kind that had nothing left to calculate or defend. "Then you had better start immediately," she said, "because Henry has already decided he wants you to teach him proper swordsmanship, and he does not intend to wait 5 more years to begin." Outside, the estate settled into a quiet, ordinary night, the first one in a very long time that held no hidden danger waiting behind it, only a family finally beginning, properly and honestly, to become exactly what it had always been on paper, and had finally, after everything, become in truth as well.